Good morning. It is April 14th, 2024, Sunday morning. The text we're going to talk about this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 36 to 48. While they were still talking about the resurrection, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking that they had seen a ghost. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands, look at my feet. It is I, myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And when he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still did not believe, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything to eat?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and he ate it in their presence. And he said to them, "This is what I told you while I was with you. Everything must be fulfilled that's written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." And then he opened their minds so that they could understand the scriptures that spoke of him. And he told them, "This is what was written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations. You are witnesses of these things." Words can be funny. If I say certain phrases, you might know where they're from. If I say Shazam or surprise, surprise, surprise. Those of us of a certain age are going to remember a TV show, The Andy Griffith Show. Nip It. We immediately see Deputy Barney Fife. The Andy Griffith Show, to the modern eye, might seem slow or quaint or silly. It was those things, but it was also deep. Andy Griffith, the sheriff, and his cast of characters had a way with words. They turned phrases, and the way that they said things made you feel affectionate toward those characters. One phrase used in multiple episodes of the Andy Griffith Show confused some English language experts. On the NPR show A Way with Words, they talk about nuances and history of language. And they did a show on the language, the phrases of the Andy Griffith Show. In the 14th episode of the Andy Griffith Show, The Horse Trader, the first scene opens with Barney explaining to Andy why he resists change. He's had a problem with this automated stamp machine down at the post office, and he refuses to buy stamps from a slot machine. So Barney writes a letter to the Postmaster General, but he can't send it because he doesn't have a stamp. And Andy shakes his head and he says, "Barney, I'll tell you the truth. You are a bird in this world." When somebody's quirky, like when Aunt Bee fusses over apples for a pie, you're a bird in this world. Andy Griffith is the only known person to use that phrase ever. Never happened before him. The radio hosts that were researching this looked in every dictionary, every dialect book, did a full search in newspapers and the internet, books, libraries, universities, all over the country. Nobody had ever written or said the phrase, "You're a bird in this world," before that show, that episode. One of my favorite phrases from that show. When something is off, something doesn't seem quite right, Andy just says, "Curious, curious." And he says it just like that. It's that feeling, curious, that you get when you tour the British Museum, you go into the Egyptian mummy exhibit, or the Museum of Natural History. and they have on display there the funeral practices of ancient Egypt or these ancient civilizations. And if it weren't for that glass barrier, that glass display case, and all the signs that say, "Do not touch," you know that we would, because we're curious. We would touch those old bones, those old relics, those pieces from antiquity, just to hold them, to somehow connect our time to the past. We're curious. And it makes sense, our fascination. When we die, living creatures eventually waste away. They disappear, they vanish. But bones and skulls and teeth and relics are like rocks, and they stay. They remain solid and permanent. They linger, and they bridge the gap between the past and the present. They give us mysterious truths about life in another time. What did they look like? What did they eat? What did they do? Where did they live? Teeth and bones. Curious. In this morning's gospel, Jesus himself is the exhibit. He is on display. And there's no glass barrier to keep his friends from touching him. He had been dead, and now he invites his friends to touch him. Touch and see, he says, holding out his hands like an old bone in a museum, to be picked up and felt and turned over in their hands. But it turns out he wasn't trying to connect them from their time to the past. He was trying really hard to connect them from their time to a future time. Jesus was full of these mysterious truths about life in a new era, not the old one. He describes a time when death and suffering won't have power over people anymore. And if the wounds on his hands and his feet and his side from the crucifixion were there, Luke doesn't mention them. Because Jesus is about the future. He is about not their time, but the next time. And he wants to prove to them that he is real, touch and see, so that they can see for themselves what that new era looks like. You got something to eat? Fish and chips for lunch. Are his disciples convinced by the display? Are they convinced what they're seeing is real? We don't know. Luke doesn't say. But the mysterious truth of this new era where death and suffering will be no more is no longer just an idea in a book or in our minds. It's not just a feeling in our hearts. It becomes flesh and blood, bones, relics. It becomes real. Things from one time that you can touch in another time. Does it work? We don't know. It is interesting, if you read the full text, to see how the disciples' reactions change. At first they're terrified and they express their doubts. But then there's this sense of joy. The text says they are doubtful because of their joy. Even though they're still confused, they can't help themselves. They're just happy. They're happy that their friend is there. Even though nowhere in this story is there any mention of their faith or their conviction, they're just happy. Maybe that's the evidence of their faith and their conviction. Jesus tries to explain the how and the why of the crucifixion and the resurrection. He goes back into the past to give them reference points from the past to the present. Tries to explain God's plot in the whole thing, the blueprint, the scheme, the strategy, the script for the story. And the disciples are just there being happy, enjoying the moment with their friend. And even during the biggest surprise of the whole story, when Jesus enlists them in this new ministry to go out and tell other people about this new era, this new time when death no longer binds us and holds us, their response, they're just happy. Joy. The response is joy. It's almost as if the disciples are just this giant group of Labrador retrievers, just excited to be there, just happy to be throwing the stick and having a good time. The thing is, though, that it's a deep joy. It's an excitement for being in the moment. Jesus suffered and died and is now alive again to put on exhibit not just his body, his flesh and blood, but to put on exhibit God's forgiveness of the sins of the world. If there are things in your life that are broken, if there are things happening to you or because of you or in you, Jesus is now flesh and bone again to display God's forgiveness and God's love, so that real people could see real things for themselves, so they can turn from the ways of their time and now start living in a new time and act in new ways. You are witnesses of these things, he says. Touch and see. So then they can turn around and help others touch and see. I find it interesting that Jesus doesn't coerce anybody. He doesn't twist arms. He doesn't exclude or belittle those who can't or who don't understand. He doesn't make fun of them for doubting. Jesus presents himself again and again in loving and compassionate ways to reassure them, to calm them, and to invite them into this new time. And I guess it really doesn't matter what they think about this risen person, their friend, being alive again, standing and talking to them just like it's a normal Monday afternoon. Regardless of their belief or their faith or their actions, they are now witnesses to what they have seen and they have heard. Love has come and stood among them alive and well, and nothing changes that. And because of that, they have joy. They can't unsee the exhibit. The living man, their friend, standing in front of them. They are witnesses and they have joy. Curious. I think this is one of the best descriptions of our job as people of faith. To be witnesses to the grace of God, no matter how it happens or where we are. And to have joy because of it. To be witnesses to the grace of God, no matter why or to whom God's love has landed. To be people who testify to our experience and to the experience of our Christian community. Because when all is said and done, that's really what we are. We are wide-eyed children of God, our hands pressed up against the display case, and we're invited to put that barrier aside and to see and to touch and to experience that love for ourselves. And I think we can reach our own conclusions about the mysteries of Easter, that Jesus was dead and is now alive. That he's alive and he's back with his friends and eating fish on the beach. We can struggle with the what ifs and the how in the worlds of it all. But we can't unsee or unhear the times that we've known for ourselves the grace and the love and the forgiveness of God. Because we are witnesses to those things, curious or not. We experienced those things. And that can never be taken away from us. And we're invited to share it with other people. We can't be ungathered. We can't be unfed at God's table. We are witnesses to these things. So let's not waste our time then, trying to belittle others into belief, trying to shame people into the right way to think about these things. Let's not waste our time trying to be the morality police, lecturing people on what they should or should not be doing. We have heard these things and we know these things. Let me tell you how much I appreciate God forgiving me. That's what we're asked to do. That's all we're asked to be. And that is the good news. The great news of all of this is that we can choose to respond with love and joy. Anywhere. Everywhere. I think the disciples needed an authentic Jesus, a flesh and bones Jesus to understand. Skull and bones, relics, flesh and blood. But they got also open hands and a taste of food and a taste of togetherness again. It's just good to be together with people who love you. And they needed it because you'll notice they went from terror to joy. And I think an awful lot of people in our world, in our time, especially where we live, need something to help them move from terror to joy, from fear to joy, from exclusion to inclusion, from outside to inside. People have more options for church than ever before. And that could be a good thing, because that means more places to share love. But it's also created in our time and in our place this consumer mindset that I can have Jesus anywhere I want, and I can go to church on the 7th tee of the golf course. And it creates a "what have you done for me lately" kind of attitude. I think it's powerful in this story that Jesus goes back to his friends and he calls them together to be community again. I think a lot of people in our time are very skeptical. Yeah, you might say you love me today, you might be nice to me today, but what happens when my mom dies? What happens when I have a kid and I need somebody to help me in the nursery at 2:30 in the morning? What happens when I lose my job, or when I retire and I don't know what to do with myself? I don't know who I am now that I don't have my work. Our challenge, I think, is to be love on display. To be consistent and present. To remove the barriers that keep people from realizing that we're real and that all we want to do is help and love. To be loving and helpful, to be servants of the good news of God's love. Hey, go ahead, touch me. Go ahead, ask me. Go ahead, let's talk about it. And in the process of figuring all this out, because I have questions, I am curious about things. But in the process of figuring all this out, let's love each other. And let's have joy, no matter where we are.